one of the things I've really loved about this game and the world building we've been able to do is start touching on parts of the world that aren't, aren't Ferelden, aren't Orlais, aren't Kirkwall, even aren't Tevinter.
Well, thank you, John, for your time. It's great to talk again with someone that is working in this game that is amazing, in my opinion. I really love what I have played so far.
Awesome.
Yeah, really love it. Well, first, what I want to know is that because the first thing you notice when you play the game is that the characters are more cartoonish or maybe colorful in a way, but the environments are more realistic. So what were the challenges of combining these two styles that are really different, but they match really great in the game?
Yeah, I mean, so you talked about there's definitely a more stylized art style for Dragon Age the Veilguard, and for us, I don't even know if it was really a challenge to get them to mix in with the level art, because as we were building, the very first thing we did was build characters. We built some of the I think the first character we built was Solus, and that kind of helped us anchor our art style and how we wanted the game to look. I do think one of the advantages of the way that the game is stylized with the characters is, I do find that with newer games, I've been playing games for a very long time, and I remember back in 1997 playing Ultima Online and being like, wow, graphics will never get more realistic than this. Obviously, they got a lot more realistic than this, but I think the more stylization of the characters gives them kind of a more timeless look, whereas the environments, they look great up close, they look great far away, and I do think there's also, as you get closer to realism, especially with character art, you tend to slip more into that uncanny valley when, you're not able to quite hit that fidelity level, because we all know, obviously we talk to people every day. We know how people are supposed to look and supposed to move. And if you're not able to nail that consistently, and in a game like Dragon Age, with I think over 500,000, words of dialogue, that's a lot of content to consistently make look ultra realistic. Getting a little bit more stylized gives us a little bit more freedom to, play with those characters, where the environments, because they are more static and also because you don't really get the same uncanny valley, we can lean a little bit more into realism with them to make them feel more believable, more grounded, while also, you're spending time in Arlington. It's a magical forest where reality is ripping apart, and yet it still looks like a real place you could go. You wouldn't want to go there necessarily, but you could go there, so.
That makes sense. And what were the main inspirations behind this new visual character style?
I'm not going to speak on it too deeply, because Matt Rhodes, as the art director, was really the driving force behind a lot of that. But he's always said he likes each game has a visual style that is, if you look at it in a painting, you can immediately recognize it. For us, it was a lot about making sure Dragon Age had a very strong and easily identifiable visual identity. I love the old games. I've been on Dragon Age since Origins, but the difficulty we would occasionally run into is, you look at a screenshot of Origins and unless you had something in there that was identifiably Dragon Age, so a character, a creature you recognized, it didn't look tremendously different from the other fantasy RPGs that were out at the time, because they were all kind of going for the same realism. So we wanted to give it an identity that, again, you look at a still frame of it, you're like, that is Dragon Age. That is identifiably, unmistakably Dragon Age.
How do you balance the high fantasy elements in Dragon Age with the more mature and dark tone that the story of the Veilguard has?
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be a bit of a challenge. And I mean, obviously, Dragon Age has gone from Origins, which was very low fantasy. It took place in Ferelden, a much muddier, less magic central, more, I don't say backwards, but that's how they're seen in the world, as a more backwards place, to Veilguard, which takes place, Minrathous being kind of at the center of the story, and Minrathous being the ultimate expression of magic as, as a motive force, as something that people can use almost as fuel. It comes down to, you can have a world that's very bright and colorful, but as long as you're sticking with themes and sticking with characters that are believable, but also, more relatable to things that we run into, themes that run through the real world as well, you can get that kind of maturity into the storytelling. And I think for Veilguard, one of my favorite moments, I don't know how far into the game you are, so I don't want to spoil too much, but early on, you get this, you go from Arlethan, which is bright and colorful, but also, very dangerous, to probably one of the first expressions of how dark and grim this game can get. And, it doesn't feel out of place in the high fantasy world because the magic, the fact that the gods are back and they're these powerful magical beings is part of what motivates that moment. They are using their power in ways that are, dark and grim, and it's about contrast. If you have, again, super high fantasy world, super colorful world, but also these very dark themes, they work because they contrast each other.
And how do you approach the design of the new areas and environments? Because and this new dark theme for the series, because it needs to feel very Dragon Age for the veteran gamers, but also it needs to feel fresh because every Dragon Age game has a new identity. Mm-hmm. So how did you do that?
Well, I think one of the advantages we had was the fact that we were going to places we'd never shown before. So Tevinter, it's a place we've talked about a lot. It's shown up in some capacity in every Dragon Age game. DAO, you had Tevinter slavers that you could fight. DA2, Kirkwall is a former Tevinter city. They used to own it, so there are a lot of these elements in its architecture. So it comes down to, because we're in a new space, we can do things we haven't done before, but also finding elements that are common, that are always part of Dragon Age. And for us, that comes down to, even in Tevinter, even in Minrathous, even a place that's so full of magic, asking ourselves, okay, but what, based on the rules of magic we've discovered, talked about before, as an example, Morgan says in Dragon Age Origins, even a shapeshifter can't alter their form to be another human. Altering a human body is very difficult, requires blood magic. Finding these rules that kind of bind these spaces together and making sure that we keep them at the center of the storytelling. But also, again, Tevinter, I don't know if, this is something that we really love about the Minrathous architecture. It draws from a lot of the Elven architecture we started introducing in Origins, but even more so in Inquisition, because Tevinter is a cargo cult copy of ancient Elvenon. They're looking at these ancient elves, what they create, and they're saying, we could absolutely do this better. They can't, because the ancient elves had magic and had access to a world without the veil, so they were able to build these magical structures. So there is this consistency. If you look at some of the Elven ruins early in the game, you look at Tevinter, the Elven ruins draw from the previous game, so there's a connection back to DAO, DAI, but they also, Tevinter draws from those Elven ruins in a way that, if you pay attention, you see that through line, that visual storytelling from one to the other.
About factions, how was the process of designing them? Because they are very different in terms of ideals, but also in terms of visual identity.
It came down to, the first step for us is always what makes the most sense for the story we want to tell. And I like to tell a story. I think I've told it before, but I'll tell it again. Trick Weeks and I, one time, Trick is our lead writer, we were sitting there talking about the factions we wanted to bring, and one of them, we had this great idea. It's I can't even remember the specifics, oh, this is going to be awesome, we're going to do this thing. We started really talking ourselves into this idea, getting excited about it, and Matt Rhodes was sitting, our art director was sitting next to us, and turned around and said, guys, I'm going to be honest, that sounds boring. And we kind of paused, we're oh, actually, you know what, you are right. We've managed to convince ourselves that this was super interesting. And I think, it was going to be a pre-Marches faction of the alliance of Kirkwall and all these other groups, and we managed to tell ourselves it was interesting. In reality, the story we were telling didn't have a space for them. So we're telling a story about the gods being blighted. Okay, obviously you need Grey Wardens. Grey Wardens are always a part of Thedas. They're always going to be there when there's a blight. Shadow Dragons, we want to tell a story about Minrathous. What's an interesting faction there? Crows, we're going Cantiva. You need to bring in the Crows. Veil Jumpers, okay, Arlethan, this magic has started pouring back in the world. We need a group that responds to that. Morinwatch, okay, we want to go to Navarra, the undead. Spirit World is obviously in turmoil. And Lords of Fortune are actually one of my favorites because they're kind of just there because they want to be. There's not really there's not really the same storytelling. There's not the world is ending and they're super concerned. It's well, there's Canary here, the Ontom invaded, and we're going to help you because why not? When it comes to visual identity, though, it comes down to what is their role in the story and what is the space they occupy. So Lords of Fortune have a lot of gold, have a lot of jewelry. They're very flashy, and that comes down to it's always intended as a more piratical faction. They're treasure hunters. Of course, they're going to show their spoils on their armor. They're not going to dress drab and restrained. They're over the top, they're flashy, and you see that with the characters in that faction too. If you go through Tasha's arc, you'll notice, the other Lords of Fortune are very larger than life type of characters. Shadow Dragons are designed to be this kind of rebellion, this mage, this underground movement to, resist the oppression of Tevinter. So you start designing them with a visual identity that says that you don't want to make them too flashy, because if you're rebels, you don't want, the magistrates will look at you like, oh, that's a rebel, let's go take him out. So they're a little bit more restrained in their visual design. Grey Wardens are an easier one, mostly because Grey Wardens have a very specific color palette. The grays, the blues, the griffin symbology. So it's kind of a mix of stuff we've done before, but also really leaning into the sense of, I think Matt Rhodes calls it, design with purpose. And it's always like, what is the elements of, why do these things matter? And like, one of the most interesting things on this project is sitting down and letting our artists talk about why they built the characters a specific way. And there's always a purpose. Every bit of, every accoutrement, every little symbol has a reason to exist the way it does. And it's always super fascinating to hear from them, like, where their thought process is.
Well, now that you're mentioning the relationship between the writers and the art team, in which ways do you think that the art helps the narrative team to tell the story? I mean, not only the factions that you were saying, but also the environments, the characters, like the color palette, everything.
I think it's, and actually I'd expand and say that this story, the thing I love about the Veilguard, and I think one of the reasons why, for me, it's such a great experience, is this storytelling involves everyone. The gameplay is built around the story. The art feeds into the story. The cinematics, everybody is part of telling this grand story. Whereas, maybe on previous projects, there was a little bit more focus on the writers. Here, we make sure it's this collaborative effort. And like you said, with the art specifically, I'll use, again, I'm going to go back to Minrathous because that's right at the beginning of the game, so I don't want to do too many spoilers, but Minrathous is, you look at Minrathous, the moment you walk out of that bar at the beginning and you look up, it tells the story of the city. You see this giant floating palace with spotlights on it. Okay, immediately this is not a place where people are free and, where everybody's happy, everybody's happy, everybody's able to do whatever they want. There's very clearly almost a police state going on, and you don't have to say a word about it. We don't say a word about it in the early game, but the moment you see that palace floating overhead with the giant spotlights shining down, you're like, okay, that tells me a story, very reminiscent of, Zeppelins with the big spotlights, really getting the sense that this is a place that is not free. And so now that I know that I need to go through this place to go find solace, I already know I'm going to come into conflict with someone, because this is not, a happy trading town. This is an amazingly over-the-top city, but it's also super oppressive. But even in the character art as well, details about the story showing up in their outfits. I use Tasha as an example. The way that their horns are set up, or the way that they braid their hair, matters to their character in a way that isn't always, necessarily deeply explained, but you look at the character, you get a lot of the story just out of that.
And well, now that the game is more dynamic and oriented to real-time combat, how did that shift influence the design of like world building, maybe character animations, and the art in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to have an impact because, real-time, a little bit more action-focused combat does have a higher bar to clear for animation fidelity. You can get away with, and I love the games, but like XCOM can get away with some pretty jank animations because it's all turn-based. You're not looking to see someone, block an attack in mid-attack and then counterattack. It's all turn-based, happens one after the other. But so it did put a higher premium on the animation fidelity, which honestly, I think, and I say this again, I love Dragon Age, been on for a while. We haven't always hit the bar with animation fidelity that we want to, largely because of engine restrictions and time restrictions. But it meant that was super important for us this time. But readability is also critical. In the moment, you need to be able to read what's going on, what enemies are doing, and be able to react to it in a way that makes sense. Obviously, you can jump into the tactical wheel, pause the action, take a breath. But we want to make sure that even if you're not, like, if you turned off every GUI element, you turned off all the attack indicators, everything, you should still be able to look at a combat scenario and understand what's going on, understand what enemies are about to do, and understand how you're going to counter that. And that comes down to, better animation, VFX use of the camera. The camera has to be designed to give you a better view of the battlefield. I will also say one thing that I've really loved about the combat is how it's enabled, honestly, some more dynamic storytelling moments. I go back to Inquisition, Adamant Fortress. Adamant Fortress was a fantastic mission, but you watched most of that siege happen. It was a big cutscene. They're sieging the fortress, and then finally at the end, you get to run around on the rooftops a little bit and fight some crappy Grey Wardens and demons. In this game, we really want you to feel like you're inside these big set-piece moments. So, without getting into spoilers again, end of Act 1, one of the biggest set pieces, I think, or I'd say up to that point, the biggest set piece we've ever done in Dragon Age, and you play through the whole thing. You're involved in the combat, and that's, I think, a lot easier when you have that more action-focused combat, because you're not trying to control a party of people and give them orders. You are actually inhabiting Rook as a character, and you're telling your teammates what to do. You're being the I think it's the difference between being a commander versus being a sergeant, and I think for the type of game that we're building, type of story we're telling, it really worked better to have you as more of a sergeant. You're in the action, you're in there with your people, and you're doing what you can to take down the enemies.
And what's the aspect of like world building, environments, and art in general that do you feel that pushes the boundaries the most in the series, and that you are particularly maybe proud of?
That's a hard question because there's a lot of spoilers involved in my answer, but I would say a less spoilery answer is one of the things I've really loved about this game and the world building we've been able to do is start touching on parts of the world that aren't Ferelden, aren't Orlais, aren't Kirkwall, even aren't Tevinter. Like, I love Tevinter, I'm proud of everything we did there, but we've talked about Tevinter a lot. We haven't talked nearly much about Navarra and how they do, how they handle the dead, how they, what the Mornwatch do, what their job is. They've shown up in some short stories, but they've never been as front and center as they are in this game. I also say, like, for me, personally, I really love what we're able to do with the elves, the Dalish, and the Ancient Elves, because I think, people joke, but it's not untrue. There was definitely, Dalish did not necessarily get the fairest fate in all the previous games. You could wipe out a clan in DA2, you could wipe out a clan in DAO, you could wipe out a clan in DAI, and it was fun to finally give them what I think is a little bit more their due, which is an opportunity to own their own story a little bit more. They're no longer just these perpetual victims. They have a chance to step up and fight back against, a world that has not been particularly kind to them, but also fight back against these gods that they've been worshiping for centuries that have turned out to very obviously be not what they thought they were. And it was really nice to be able to give them that moment of stepping up and leading the fight against their own gods in a way, because they, more than anyone else, they've been victimized by, Gillenane and Elgranon coming back and basically saying, hey, we aren't actually gods, we're incredibly powerful mages, and we're going to destroy the world. And, there's an opportunity to tell a story there where the Dalish fall in line, and I think it was a lot of fun to give them the chance to say, you know what, no, screw this, we're fighting back, you're not who we thought you were, we're standing up for our people, standing up for this world. And I think that's the part I'm most proud of in this game.
Well, last question, what was the biggest challenge for you and your team during development, and how did you overcome it?
Oh, I've got a few answers for that one. I think, honestly, the biggest challenge on this one is just, it's been so long since the previous Dragon Age game. By the time we're coming out, it's going to be nearly 10 years, not quite to the day, but within a few weeks of Dragon Age Inquisition. And building a game that is both, feels like coming home to people who've been fans of the franchise for a while. And I think once you get into the game, you'll definitely, people who are fans of Origins, Inquisition, DA2 are going to feel that way, but also allowing it to be something that if you've never played a Dragon Age before, you can jump in and understand what's going on and get into these characters, get into the story. Finding that balance is always tricky, because you never want to, there's a very easy way to do it, which is make the main character not have any idea what's going on. But if you're a player who's played Dragon Age before, you know what these things are. Why would your character not? That starts to play out of the storytelling. So finding that balance of new versus old, and I'm super proud of the team. I think they've nailed it. But I'd say of the challenges that we ran into, that was probably the biggest one, is just getting that balance right.
Thank you, John, for your time. Thank you, everyone. It was a wonderful interview.
Well, thank you. That was a lot of fun.